Sí, 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 sí. Ey, ey.
Sure. Still have a old laptop. What just happened? Please.
One second.
I will
It's
tell you.
recording right now, but you
So channels with the number of degrees of freedom represented. You? Can you? Yeah. Okay. So, okay. So, there is, constant administrative and political pressures, particularly by the mobile industry, right, to increase more spectrum, all right? And however, there is absolutely no expectations that the amount of spectrum that is made available will be proportional to demand. Okay. All right. So essentially, so you have a curve, you have a demand and supply curve. The release of spectrum, so if the demand is geometric or exponential, the supply of spectrum may be linear. So if you have two curves, one which is linear, one is exponential, after a while the gap will keep on significantly growing. So this, by definition, is what is called spectrum crunch or spectrum scarcity. You basically cannot rely on spectrum to solve your problems. You have to rely on everything else, MIMO, better modulation coding, better network efficiency, better max, okay? Network densification, which is, what increases what we call the network spectral efficiency, all of these to meet these, very challenging goals. So to me, spectrum sharing is going to be a fact of life, all right? And I say this from a U.S. perspective. I think the U.S. Kind of leads spectrum sharing for the following reasons. It has policies in place as a result of which spectrum sharing systems. So this is for all of you cognitive, all of you and me who have written cognitive radio papers for the last 10 years without having seen a cognitive system, in practice, right? There are millions of papers on cognitive radio on IEEE Explore, and there is not a single cognitive network that you can see in practice. The news from the US is that is going to change, okay? The two systems that I'm going to talk about are actually being engineered, okay? They're going to be deployed, right? And so let me move on, right? So, and if you ask me why this has happened, it is because that in the US, there is a presidential directive. It is law which is forcing this. Okay. So there's a law which is forcing this, and the regulator is obliged to follow the law and actually try to make technical rules which promote spectrum sharing. All right. And the US regulator, which is the FCC, more than just follows the law, the other thing that the FCC has done, in my opinion, well, is to promote unlicensed spectrum. So if you come to the US, and this is in sharp contrast with Europe, Asia, any other country that I know, the amount of unlicensed spectrum in US is much larger. So for example, the 5 gigahertz band, between 5 to 6 gigahertz, which, by the way, if you come to the US, most of our Wi-Fi networks is in the 5 gigahertz band. They're migrated. 2.4 gig is too congested already. So on my campus at the University of Washington, all the access points are 5 gigahertz. 700 megahertz of the 5 to 6 gigahertz band is unlicensed in the US, right? So the context to my talk is two very important things. Spectrum sharing. So what I mean by spectrum sharing is your old definition of cognitive radio. that there will be in any given band a primary user, an incumbent, which is typically, obviously, which is going to be a licensed user, somebody who owns that nominally from the past. Usually, it is going to be a government user, typically, all right? So it's going to be a sharing between a licensed incumbent with a new, what in cognitive radio terms, secondary, unlicensed user, right? That's what I mean by spectrum sharing. Also, the availability of unlicensed spectrum is increasing. So, previously, to make this very simple, the world was black and white. There was unlicensed, very small fraction, 10%, licensed, 90%. We will now have gray, which is shared spectrum. Okay? And when I say shared spectrum, this is not like the, your ASA, LSA sharing between two licensed users. It is in the cognitive radio sense, sharing between a licensed and an unlicensed user. Okay. So I'm going to skip this. All right. Now this is a 5G, and so I'm going to talk about 3 small subproblems. The second one is something that Lorenza and her group are very familiar with because the mode of analysis includes NS3, and the work was done in collaboration with Lorenzo's group. But let me talk about a first problem, which is relatively new, and which comes from this spectrum sharing paradigm. So I mentioned to you in the US, there are 2 systems which are being engineered. So there were 2 bands for you to remember. One is, the one I will talk about is the 3.5 gigahertz band. So due to a presidential directive, which, let me tell you this for those who are interested, this is the presidential memorandum signed by the previous president. Okay, so it is the law of the land in the US, which says make 500 megahertz of licensed spectrum owned by the government, it has to be released for spectrum sharing. Okay? And it gave a timeline. So it's a very strict and carefully written document. It gave a timeline by 2020. So this is what you would call the first installment. 150 megahertz in 3.5 gigahertz. 150 megahertz in 3.5 gigahertz, which is now going to be shared between who? So who are the the federal users of 3.5 gigahertz in the US? Lots of radars. Okay, and so that's why this is a radar with any unlicensed user, any unlicensed. So it is sharing with whom? New broadband wireless access, right? This is the main use case. So if it's new broadband wireless access, if it is unlicensed, you think of 2 technologies, either Wi-Fi or LTE unlicensed, right? So you will see increasingly work and papers in radar Wi-Fi coexistence or radar LTE-U unlicensed coexistence. So I picked radar Wi-Fi to illustrate, this problem, all right? Similarly, of course, in 5 gigahertz, I just told you, there is 700 megahertz unlicensed. And 5 gigahertz is where most of the mobile operators, so I live in Seattle, we have the number 3 operator in the US whose headquarters is Seattle, which is T-Mobile, previously owned by Deutsche Telekom, but it is now is headquartered in Seattle. They have been trialing, actually, for the last few months, T-Mobile has been trialing using Nokia hardware, LTE, LAA. They actually have LTE, LAA turned on, this told me 2 weeks ago in 6 markets. So they are trialing LTE, LAA, and LTE-U, okay, to go into operations. Okay? So they are, recording. They are reporting download speeds of 10 megabits per second, okay, with LTE, LAA. So 5 gigahertz is the target band for all the operators, Verizon, AT&T, and so on and so forth, to try out small cell technologies. Okay, in our license. So this is that. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a project which is existing. It's a separate project funded by NSF, which kind of supports my, the overall. So as you can guess, if you have to do real spectrum sharing, not spectrum sharing for papers, okay, what is the system architecture going to look like? So for those of you who have studied this, seriously, you always will need some kind of data aggregation database, all right, in order to make this system. Right? So you have two heterogeneous technologies. So, okay, for all of you who read cognitive radio, what is the first sentence in all those million cognitive radio papers that you care to recall and forget? Okay. The first sentence in any cognitive radio was, we know that most of the spectrum is licensed and it is poorly used. Right? That's the first theorem of cognitive radio. Okay. Well, do you have evidence to believe that? You just read somebody else's papers and say, okay, somebody famous said it, so it must be true. Right? So the point is the following. We all believe, the belief of cognitive radio starts from some of these unexplored assumptions. This is the problem of academia. 5 people say it, and then in order to write the 500th paper, you copy and paste that assumption. Right? The fact of the matter is that if I go around, Europe, Asia, Africa, wherever, and I ask, who has spectrum data? Okay? There is no public spectrum database in the hands of people like us. If anybody has spectrum data, it's probably, the operators, and they're not going to give it to you. Right? So for a long time, getting spectrum data, there's been sporadic efforts. I know that, in Petri, Mahonen, and Aachen, etc., in Finland, there have been sporadic sort of efforts. But what I mean sporadic is, can you get that data? No, you can't get that data. That data was taken for a project and it was never made public anymore, right? So one of the key issues in this, this business of spectrum sharing is, if you all say that licensed spectrum is poorly used, well, how exactly is it poorly used? Which bands are poorly used? When is it used? When is it unused? Because without having that information, you cannot you cannot architect a sharing system, right? Remember, we are talking about a real-time system in which spectrum sharing. So spectrum sharing means taking a resource, allocating it over time, space, and possibly frequencies, right? So you have to monitor spectrum usage in time, space, and frequency in real time, create databases, right? Make that database available to, famously, machine learning, everybody's famous topic these days, or whatever the tools that you use to analyze it. And then based on that analysis, drive, close the loop, resource allocation, randomness. The big problem is there has literally been very little work in actually building, such databases. So we have actually a hardware infrastructure deployed in Philadelphia and on campus in the University of Washington, which is taking persistent spectrum data using commodity software-defined radios, which I know many of you use. Okay? And it is making this data available on the public cloud. Now, of course, for you, it's not very interesting to see data in Philadelphia, but it is instructive to see that such a system can be actually set up and architected at relatively low cost with, and this is the most important thing, with a software control plane, which gives people the visibility and some knobs, just like going into the lab and operating a spectrum analyzer. Okay. All right, so that's the third point of the presentation. So I'm taking too much time, so let me speed up. So by the way, I said there were 2 bands for which spectrum sharing in the US is going to occur. One is 3.5 gig. The other one is what's called the additional AWS3, the additional wireless spectrum band, which is the 1.7 gig band, right? These are 2 bands in which spectrum sharing using some kind of real-time monitoring, spectrum monitoring databases, right, is actually being engineered now. And guess, of course, who is interested? Obviously, the operator is interested because this is making them available new spectrum in a shared sense. Unusual companies are very unusual meaning for communication. All the internet companies, Google is very interested, Microsoft is very interested, because if you tell them, this is a database play, that you may actually, by deploying sensors, own data, and then you can do a lot of machine learning and add value to the data and return it to other people, they suddenly think that this is a good business project for them to be in. They don't want to be in the business of operating a telecom network, but they certainly want to be in the business of having new products which support a future network for spectrum sharing. So spectrum sharing gives rise to a lot more interesting, systems engineering and, productization possibilities on the data side. as well as on the hardware side. Okay? So you will see. So if you want more details about what are the technical bodies which are leading, for example, the standardization, I can point to you for 1.7 gigahertz and 3.5 gigahertz. Okay? So, but essentially, I can tell you, if you go to Google and Mountain View, there are teams, which are building, Google databases, readying Google databases to take in spectrum data and then analyze it. All right. Okay. I will skip all this. So by the way, what about the incumbents? So I said to you that these are, so DOD is shorthand for Department of Defense in the US, so treat this as the federal government, right? So this is a list. So if this is a list. So you ask yourself, who are these people who use 1.7 gigahertz? Well, actually, before I started this work, I didn't have an answer to the question. Here's a partial list of who uses this, right? The point in all these lists, this is only to realize the following. If you go and ask your own, Spanish military, police, and so on and so forth, what you see here is a list of many, many networks which are used very sporadically. Which are used, when I say sporadically, limited in time and frequency. So even, for example, if you have like a satellite or aeronautical downlink, right? Okay, in the interferences around, which are ground stations, where the interferences, right? So similarly, if these radios are used in a military base or in a police station, what you have to do is find ways of sharing in and around that is geographically localized. They may be using some of these radios once a month. Who knows how often they use some of these? Some of these are really so. Suffice it to say that there is ample opportunities of spectrum sharing. Right? Let's take the case of a radar. So suppose you have most of us see a radar when we go to the airport. Okay? So you have a radar, which is what we call a surveillance radar, right? Okay? So a typical radar, it emits pulses, and it is rotating, at certain frequency, correct? So if you have a Wi-Fi network, the only time the Wi-Fi network is impacted is when the radar beam points at you, right? A radar sweeps, a typical radar sweeps at about one rotation, one revolution per second. So you basically have a packet drop once every second, or packet drops once every second, right? So when the radar is pointing away from you, normal operation continues. Again, many such federal systems are localized, and this one is a spatial localization, right? So they're localized in space, they're localized in time, they're localized in angle, right? So the point is this, that there is ample opportunities for spectrum sharing. Okay. All right, so this is simply a slide saying, okay, so now when you think about sharing, this is what we call a classical het net, heterogeneous networks. So I want to emphasize the fact that this term has been used, overused long enough. When you have two heterogeneous networks, one of which impacts the other. This is a topic from basic communications theory, which used to be studied classically in terms of interference long ago, and then there has not really been much interest in it for a long time. Right? And the point is, for those of you who have done some of this work, particularly if some of you have done work in sort of 2G with spread spectrum and others, which was a classical interference channel, narrowband interfering with the spread spectrum, right? This was 2G code, a wideband system, a direct sequence spreading system, and a narrowband system. Okay? Classic old interference problem. The important thing to realize is there is significant asymmetry in how one impacts the other. The impact of a narrowband system on a wideband system in terms of bit error rate, symbol error rate, SNR, take it what you will, is quite different from how the wideband system impacts the narrowband system. Right? So if you take these two very different heterogeneous networks and you are trying to find means of coexistence, and this is something we ran into in the second project, 3GPP, notably use this word fairness, that coexistence should be fair. And this, in my opinion, is a very loaded word, because if you go and ask people, each of us have our notions of fairness, right? Okay? There is no unified notion of fairness. Right? And in this case, using a definition of fairness that is ill-defined actually causes more problems than good. It causes more technical confusion, right? And leads to, so, Lorenzo and, Liliana will tell you this in the second project, which we were driven by, or we were actually asked to simulate scenarios which determine a 3GPP specified, absolutely a 3GPP specified scenario, which asked us to determine is sharing fair. Okay, and after some work, you will learn that that question is poorly phrased, as defined by 3GPP. Because in real life, you have these two camps, a LTE camp and a Wi-Fi camp. One claiming it is fair, the other claiming it is very unfair, and there is no common communication between the two, right? So this is a source, So what I want to point out is this: when you have heterogeneous networks, their impacts are asymmetric. Okay? And in order to, I recommend to you that you should not you should not impose the term fairness first up without being very careful in defining it. If you're loose in defining it, as they have done in 3GPP, you get a mess. Okay? And so it is better to ask other questions as to what is the impact on throughput on one or the other, or latency on one and the other, without asking the first question is it fair? Because as we say in life, nothing is fair. So, why should LTE and Wi-Fi be fair? All right. So, so I wanted to say this up front, that when you have heterogeneous networks, be prepared for a lot of asymmetries. Be very careful in analyzing what these asymmetries are, and if preferably don't talk about fairness first, unless you're very careful in defining what fairness means in this scenario. So. These are two strategies of collaboration. So now you have two networks, right? And you ask yourself, how can they coexist? At a very high level, it's very simple. Do they have information shared or not? So I call this collaborative or non-collaborative, right? Now, as you can guess, in terms of network evolution, it is easiest to design systems which are non-collaborative, right? Okay, so for example, one non-collaborative means this is the classical treat the other as interference of noise and try to retrofit my system to deal with an external interference, right? So you can do this readily, right? I use whatever information I have about the available system, from none to a lot, in order to retrofit, right? Collaborative would mean, and that's a future scenario based on we'll use this term, spectrum manager, a database, something which collects data from both the networks. Right? Real-time data for both the network, analyzes it jointly, and then pushes, actions back to both the networks in order to jointly optimize operations, right? So collaborative is yet TBD. Much of the current work is really non-collaborative, okay? And this is how we typically will evolve design of systems, right? So I will talk today about non-collaborative approaches of radar Wi-Fi coexistence. And the first thing I will say is the following, right? This problem is actually not new. So this is not a new problem. As with everything, right? If you're a PhD student, people come and say, you have not discovered a new problem. You probably may have found a new way to approach an old problem. So let me tell you why this is not a new problem. So for those of you again studied Wi-Fi, and I have done Wi-Fi for a very long time. So I mentioned to you that, Wi-Fi started. Fundamentally, Wi-Fi was a home technology in the 2.4 gigahertz band. That's how it started, as a technology. And then it moved from the home to enterprises, still in 2.4. And then 5 gigahertz came along in the US, right? Why? Because of, so you know that in 2.4 gigahertz, there is virtually only, 80 megahertz of spectrum, ISM band spectrum, okay? It's very crowded. You have Bluetooth, ovens, and all kinds of things. There's only 80 megahertz of spectrum. When 5 gigahertz came along, there were already 300 megahertz initially, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, 5.4, outdoors 5.7, 5. There were already 300 megahertz allocated long ago. And as I said, in 2014, the FCC allocated another 300 megahertz, made it unlicensed. By the way, this is not ISI. This is only unlicensed in North America. Okay, so it's 600. So you had a huge amount of unlicensed spectrum. Wi-Fi migrated to 5 gigahertz. Right? So remembering that a lot of the Wi-Fi chip vendors are US-based, and they were selling to the US market, this was a natural migration. However, remember this is not an ISM band. So that same Wi-Fi 5 gig device, when it travels to Japan and in Europe, it's in immediate trouble. Why? Because here, for you in many countries, this is 5.1 to 5.2 is not unlicensed. Okay. As a matter of fact, there are radars in Europe, in Japan. Right? So, Wi-Fi, 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, in order for that same hardware to be used in other countries, had to be certified for radar coexistence. Okay. And this already, if you did Wi-Fi research, has a name called DFS. For those of you who know, it's called dynamic frequency scanning. Everybody know what that is? So basically, a Wi-Fi AP, 5 gigahertz AP, in the MAC, in the lower MAC, it has to have an additional feature, which is periodically it must scan all the channels and must detect radar presence. So I will tell you. Okay. There is this. So this is it's taken from an ECC standards. I forget. You know, maybe I have the. Yeah. This is originally from an ECC standard for Wi-Fi operation in the 5 gigahertz band in Europe, which is a requirement for radar coexistence for Wi-Fi devices. This is what it says. Dynamic frequency selections means the AP must periodically scan, and it must do two things. So you can read all this, the details. If the network is starting up, it must scan the band, identify any band in which it detects a radar pulse, and stay the hell out of the band. Okay? So this is in what is called out-of-service monitoring. This is a cold start. It was with 99% probability detect a radar signal anything above minus 62 dBm within 60 seconds. Okay? If it is already operating and a radar turns on, it must detect the radar or at any level of minus 62 dBm with 60% probability within 60 seconds and evacuate. Right? This is already a requirement for Wi-Fi. So this is the coexistence mechanism imposed on Wi-Fi. Right? So this is already a benchmark. It's there in products, is what I'm saying. It's not a new, fundamentally, this existence is not a new problem. There is an existing solution. Right? So what are we trying to do? We have an existing solution. Right? Okay, so let me tell you what we were trying to do. And this is actually quite interesting. Whoops. Oops, wrong direction. Okay, so what are we trying to do? I will tell you in our work which has been published, I'll happy to send you the paper. We have an innovation on, so if you look at this, you ask yourself, does it take 60 seconds to make this? Really? Okay. You know, 60 seconds is good for periodic scan and really non-real-time operation, right? If you want to make this real-time, right, you got to be able to improve that latency to much better than 60 seconds, right? Okay. So you know, as I said, the mode of operation in AP is every periodically it does this scan, right? But you will imagine that in a real-time system, you will basically, an AP would basically be doing this channel scan in the background for you. Right? So now, let me give you, so I will tell you what this is good for. So this is, again, a systems perspective. Goes back to the kind of system that is being engineered. And I failed to mention, I have other projects with, you know, the US Department of Defense, which is tasked with exactly engineering part of this database. Okay, so let me explain to you what this database-driven coexistence mechanism between. So this is, treat this as an example. Radar Wi-Fi is simply a stand-in for such a typical coexistence problem. This, I predict, will be, this architecture will be repeated, you know, for a satellite downlink with a LTE. Okay, so this is just an example. So let me explain this to you. So if you look at this picture, you see a Federal, so in this case, it's a monostatic radar. So it's a transmit-receive monostatic radar, you know, looking up, all right? All those black mock-ups are Wi-Fi APs, right? So this is a radar operating somewhere near Barcelona, okay? Somewhere near a population center, all right? what is the design objective? The design objective in any cognitive radio is you want a Wi-Fi like unlicensed network to operate without unduly causing interference to the radar, right? This is the second statement in your million cognitive radio papers, right? Secondary transmission subject to an interference constraint on the primary, right? Okay. How is this done in practice? The way this is done in practice is to impose what is called an exclusion region. All right. So it is quite not too difficult for you to convince yourself that there has to be an exclusion region defined as the shaded area in which, right, there is no co-channel reuse. So when I say co-channel reuse, anybody have an idea how much bandwidth a radar, say a pulse radar like the one uses? Okay, less than 5. Typically 1 megahertz is a good example. Some more high bandwidth radar. So you will read today, you ask your radar colleagues, a high bandwidth radar is 5 megahertz, maybe 10, right? Typical radar. So, you know, these radar pulses are like a microsecond pulse, right? So it's like an RF pulse, 1 microsecond, 1 megahertz. Okay, right? High resolution is 5 megahertz, right? What does it mean? It's less than 1 Wi-Fi channel, 120 megahertz channel. Okay. So if, as I said, if a radar pulse impinges, you're going to, you know, one channel is going to be affected, right? So what you're going to see, so that's the co-channel. So the typical operating scenario is determine that exclusion region in which Wi-Fi is forced to shut off in that co-channel. Correct? Now, as you can guess, if you are given the charge to determine this, why is that? It's very simple. You know, a single Wi-Fi source too close enough to the receiver will provide unacceptable interference to the radar. Let's say, so you have a radar, all of us communication theorists know receiver operating characteristics, PD, PFA, right? So if I make, you know, bring in an interfering source too close, the PD will drop, the PFA will rise, it will be unacceptable, the radar guy will throw you in prison, and, you know, your research career will have a very short life. Okay? So you have to have, you know, adequate separation, right? And that's the reason for the exclusion. Of course, the net interference that the radar sees from Wi-Fi is stochastic, because this is a second issue. I was doing this research. I asked one of my students, "Can you tell me where are all the Wi-Fi APs on campus?" Do you know? On your campus. Or how did you go get that information? Right? Not easy. So actually, when you start looking at all these questions and you ask, so it's very simple. So if for those of you who are mathematically inclined, how do you model these AP deployments? As a spatial point process, right? Okay, I can drop randomly, and this has been done in a lot of communications literature, you know, 2D Poisson processes, homogeneous, non-homogeneous, you know, clustered, you know, there's enough literature how to simulate this. So my point is this, based on the stochastic deployment on the APs, the aggregate interference of the radar, the statistics of it matters, is different. Actually, for those of you who are interested in it, the aggregate statistics is not Gaussian. Okay? It is rarely Gaussian, it's typically not Gaussian, right? So that's what you're trying to, you know, you have aggregate statistics at the radar receiver, you're trying to, you know, minimize the average or the outage probability, you know, below some limits in order to, you know, meet the interference constraint, right? So this itself is a very, so how are you going to meet this? You have to answer the question that I asked. Do you know where all the Wi-Fi points are? So if I give you a population map in, you know, Castel de Fer, in Barcelona, do you know which houses are APs? How many APs are there in an office building? What is their power, transmit power? And actually, this is not an easy question. I asked my IT person, right? When we have actively managed APs, the frequency and the channel is changing. This is not a static scenario. So actually, the amount of, you know, power, interference power in a particular band is dynamic. So I did ask him, you know, this question. So doing this calculation mathematically, analytically is, you know, one level, but actually putting it into practice is different. Why am I saying this? You can do all these math, but when you have to engineer the system in practice, it goes back to section 3. You've got to have real-time monitoring. Okay? So if you have to answer the question that I just asked, I have to put a spectrum monitor inside, because that's where most of the Wi-Fi access points are, at every building and pull the data. Okay? So if they don't allow you to put the spectrum monitor, you all know, for those of you who do Wi-Fi, there is something called a RF LAN controller, which actually has the data, but it is closed. So I know on my campus, there is a lot of, for every 250 APs, there is a big box that Cisco and HP sells, which is their major profit. Not the APs, the big box costs $50,000, which is pulling data from all the access points, running their algorithms to manage the Wi-Fi networks. Okay? Are you going to get the data? Okay? Just the same reason there's in a cellular network, there's all the data at the switch behind the base stations. So they're not going to give you the data. The operator. So same thing. The data does exist in the network. If they're kind, they'll give you the data. Otherwise, you put up your own infrastructure to passively measure. That's the only way you're going to get answers of the kind that I'm talking about. But anyway, be that as it may, this is the architecture of the system that has to be achieved. In order to protect it, you must determine that protection region, right? And determining, so let me say this looks like a very innocuous question. It is actually very hard to answer correctly. Guess why? So I just gave you one little hint. I just told you the stochastic geometry of the deployment impacts that. There is worse, the propagation model. So remember I said the protection is at the victim receiver, right? All right? I just told you what the interfering sources are characterized like, right? Location, transmit power, antenna pattern, right? I did not tell you what the path loss. The path loss significantly impacts what is the aggregate interference power, okay? Is the source inside, as it would normally be with Wi-Fi, inside buildings, and the victim outside, which is where radars are, right? Or are there, increasingly, like in 5 gigahertz, are there outside Wi-Fi access points, right? So by the way, you should know, typically indoors, the Wi-Fi transmit power is about 200 milliwatts. Okay? Outside, in 5.7 gig, the FCC, at least in the US, allows the transmit power to be 1 watt. All right. So there is significant such variations in use cases, what the contributions to the aggregate power is. So suffice it to say, this problem is a challenging problem. You can do, some a priori design, etc. But when you have to implement this in real time, there is no alternative to having real-time spectrum monitoring. To actually gather the data that you need. So anyway, let me, not belabor this. I hope I got the point here. So let me give you a very interesting example. This sort of exclusion region calculations are actually starting to be done, not just by people like me, but by people who need to engineer the system. So people who have their careers on, on the line. So remember this. This is a fairly sensitive issue, right? What is the cost of getting this design wrong? You're going to impact a sensitive federal installation. So as I said, somebody will come knocking at your door at the middle of the night that, because of your design, my radar got knocked out, right? So this is not a sort of, writing another paper, okay? So let me give you an example. So what happened? So by the way, I was telling Chavi yesterday that in the US, this is a very interesting sort of scenario for the first time. By the way, so in the US, we have a very interesting spectrum regulatory regime. You expect in most countries, there is one spectrum regulator. That means you have a soccer game with one referee. And in the US, we have a soccer game with 2 referees. We have 2 regulators who, by law, have parallel authority. So we all know about the FCC, for those of you who do this work, which is called the Federal Communications Commission. By law, they have only authority on the civilian spectrum. Because the FCC is a body of the US Congress, which is the parliament. They report to the US Parliament. The US Parliament owns, the FCC owns broadcast spectrum, TV, cellular spectrum, unlicensed spectrum. It has no authority on radars, on GPS, on satellites, so all the 80% of the spectrum that the other authority owns, which is called the NTIA, which you have never heard of. Okay? They, by US law, do not report to the Congress. They report to the Pentagon. Okay? And the US president is the super authority, is the, as we call the review referee, the review person of the two referees. In case of a conflict between the two, it goes to the president of the US to resolve. But the FCC owns 20% of the spectrum that we all use and live in. The other guy owns 80% of the spectrum, right? So here we are talking about for the first time. Spectrum sharing forces these two people to actually start. They have never had to talk to each other. If they fight amongst each other, they all go to the president and say, okay, you resolve it, right? This was the resolution mechanism. For the first time, behind these calculations, expert bodies of two groups had to sit together and actually knock heads, in an adversarial manner in order to. So I will tell you what happened. So let me tell you what this picture is. In the 3.5 gigahertz, right, which is one of the bands that I talked about, I mentioned to you the major federal users are radars. But I didn't tell you what type of radars. The major radars are shipborne radars. Okay, so you want to, let me ask you something. So that means US Navy ships with huge radars, right? So if I've ever seen a Navy ship, if it docks do Navy ships dock in Barcelona? I can tell you one thing that they do. When they come into the port, they turn their radar off. Okay, every ship which comes in, because these radars emit maybe a megawatt of power. Okay, if you don't turn the damn radar off, your cellular infrastructure is fried. Okay, so every ship when it comes into port, they turn the radar off. Now that is a head scratcher if you are a military intelligence analyst. Right? Because what is the purpose of radars? It is an anti-missile defense. It's supposed to be observing, impending launches for, nutcases in various parts of the world, right? So usually these ships are all in international waters looking for all this. And now you have a paradox. When they come to your home port, the radar is off. You're defenseless, right? This is a very strange thing, but that's what has to happen. That the radar has to be turned off. Okay. Now, so the other question is, at any point in time, suppose somebody asks you, do you know where the US Navy ships are? Are they at the US ports? And the answer is no. Right? The answer is the US naval ship is in all types of interesting places in the world. It docked in Poland, docked near the Middle East, docked in, right? They're anywhere but in the US, right? There are maybe like, 30 naval, I don't know what the number is, but on the road, very few naval warships, and they're all over the place. So does it make sense to lock up spectrum in the continental US where 80-90% of the time the ship is not in port, right? So this is a worst case analysis. So firstly, repeat the fact that there is enough opportunity for spectrum sharing, because you're given spectrum to naval radars which are never close to the continental US. Right? You can readily reuse it. When they're actually at port, okay, where are the ships? Well, their ships are in Richmond, Virginia, Miami, Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, right? That's where the ports are. So where will you need protection? You need protection along the coastline, right? If I'm in Kansas, I don't need protection. The radar is off, even if there is some leakage and so on and so forth, I'm not going to be impacted. So now, so essentially, in this case, in the spectrum scenario case, what the operating scenario that the government wants is, the ship comes into port, it shuts the radar off, it turns it away, okay, from the mainland, right? At a low power, okay, very, very low power, to keep observing, it's to keep doing its basic mission. The concern, of course, is that you have side lobes, which are leaking back into the mainland. So now, when you have such a scenario, what is the aggregate interference from all of your Wi-Fi networks or your LTE networks, which may be co-channel, So So now here's the question. Are there Wi-Fi or LTE networks in 3.5 gigs? No. But this is a supposed use in terms of spectrum sharing. Suppose the FCC were to enable, and this is what the proposal is, to enable unlicensed secondaries like Wi-Fi and LTE to use the spectrum, right? What is the exclusion region? What is the so this expert committee of the two, they met together and they drew by consideration of all the factors that I mentioned, deployment of sources, path losses, so on and so forth. They came up with the first iteration, like this was done. This is a report from an actual committee called the CSMAC 2015. They drew the first exclusion region, which is the yellow line. All right? So the definition again of the exclusion region is to the right of the yellow line on the east coast and to the left of the yellow line on the west coast, there is no Wi-Fi, no LTE unlicensed, right? Which basically means I and anybody in Google and anybody in Los Angeles, anybody in Qualcomm will have no Wi-Fi. Okay? So if you look at the exclusion region, it excludes 60% of the US population, right? Or some number. Okay? And then so immediately, so here's my question. Well, how do they come up with this? So the question you would ask is, how do they come up with this? My point in showing you this is the question that I mentioned, that calculating this exclusion region is not trivial. Because then they went back, so they were told, please go ahead and redo this. This is unacceptable. And then they went back and they got the blue line. Right? So what's the difference between the yellow line and the blue line? Assumptions. What is the assumption? Notably, if you did these sort of calculations, the path loss model, as you can guess, right? For those of you who do these path loss calculations, based on the assumptions, there 20 dB difference can easily occur, all right? Based on, all right? So what I want to point out here is that when you have these critical calculations, which depend on many, many factors, there's extreme sensitivity, of the desired end result to some very important things. Again, how are you going to resolve this? Better data, better monitoring. You can do all the a priori analysis that you want, and this is what you'll end up with, right? So I go back to this, the fact that when cognitive radios are going to be engineered, there will be a significant component of a sensing infrastructure, all right? Gathering data, analyzing it, and then pushing it back to the cognitive radios, right? In order to meet the system requirements. So anyway, this is one example. So let me tell you this. So in that same spirit, in order to improve this sort of detection, exclusion region calculations, I already mentioned to you that for Wi-Fi, we already have an existing solution called dynamic frequency select. So what are we trying to do? Well, what we're trying to do is this. Here's an innovation. So somebody told us, we should have filed this as a patent, but as faculty, professors, we really care to do. So here's an idea. And this idea is in the class of an unexploited opportunity in Wi-Fi that nobody has thought about, all right? So let me explain to you what this is. Again, this is all based on, for those of you who love and do Wi-Fi analysis and, run simulations and do analysis, you'll see, so I'll just give you the root of the idea. So particularly for those of you, how many of you have simulated, a single Wi-Fi network at NS3? Biliana has and Zohar has. But even if you haven't, let me tell you what this is. So all of you know the Wi-Fi MAC called DCF, which is based on CSMA/CA, right? Okay. So let me tell you one of these features. So let's say you have a radar which emits pulses. Each pulse is like a 1 microsecond pulse. Interpulse separation is 100 microseconds. That's a typical example. These are short RF pulses, right? Right. And now these pulses arrive and impact a co-channel Wi-Fi network, right? And what I'm trying to do is trying to detect the presence of this pulse quicker than that 60 seconds, right? I want to, reduce that detection delay. All right. Okay, so I need to come up with a new idea. So, okay, here's the new idea that we based on. So normally, how would you do it? There are two ways that you would think about doing this, and we have explored both approaches. One is the pulse impacts a Wi-Fi packet on the air, right? So the Wi-Fi packet is hit, it is dropped. So that is the reactive way, right? A Wi-Fi notices a increase momentarily of a packet loss rate, right? And it informs, the database that, I have a packet loss, right? And therefore, then I can do some diagnostics as to, is the cause of the packet loss a pulse hit, or is it due to collisions with other, Wi-Fi packets or interference from Bluetooth or somewhere, right? So that's the level of discrimination that I have to do, right? So one way is the radar causes Wi-Fi packet drops, that is reported, you analyze it, it is reactive, right? And you use that to, take whatever corrective action that you see, right? The other, so this was the first idea. So actually you explored both. Today I'm just going to talk about the other idea. The other idea is this. A radar pulse is 1 microsecond, right? What's typically a Wi-Fi packet like? Order of milliseconds or hundreds of microseconds, right? So those of you who know the DCF MAC, what's the CIFS duration? Several microseconds. What's the diff duration? 20 microseconds, right? My point is this. A radar pulse, and so these diffs and then there is the random back off, right? The short answer is this. For those of you who have simulated a Wi-Fi network, an AP with certain number of clients, there are naturally occurring gaps. If you do a time trace, there are naturally occurring gaps on a timeline in which a Wi-Fi network, there is no transmissions. Everybody is either backed or fullest. Of course, these naturally occurring gaps are of random durations. It depends on the number of clients, etc., so on and so forth, packet rates and packet. So it depends on a lot of facts. But at a high level, every Wi-Fi network has what we call silent periods. And these silent periods are easily tens of microseconds long on average. So what am I saying? A radar pulse which is 1 microsecond can drop into, opportunistically drop into one of these silent periods. If a radar pulse drops into one of these silent periods, you have a very high SNR detection scenario because it is virtually, interference free. So you have these, I said earlier, you have two forks enable, for a Wi-Fi's ability to detect radar. One is when a pulse hits a Wi-Fi packet. You then have a harder problem because you have a low SNR. Okay, so the desired problem is to detect the pulse in the presence of a Wi-Fi packet, right? Okay, that's a harder problem. In the second scenario, the pulse drops into a silent period. You have a very, high SNR pulse, just noise. Easier problem. But the probability that a radar hits the pulse, a pulse radar pulse hits the Wi-Fi packet is actually much higher. The probability that luckily the radar pulse drops into a silent period is actually much lower, but not zero. I'll show you some estimates. Okay, it is probably around 15 to 20% that you have a probability on average that a 1 microsecond radar pulse lands in a silent. So that is the unexploited opportunity. So I will not go into details, but the idea is this. One can do fast, reliable detection of a radar pulse, right? If you just relied on luck to help you out, that a single radar pulse drops into a silent period. So this is one of our first work that we published. We of course analyzed it, characterized it. What is the mean delay, right? Okay. Is it better than the 60 seconds, right? So actually that 60 seconds is a horribly loose. Well, you can do way better, right? So in some sense, anyway, I will skip all this CSMA CMAC overview. But so in our analysis, what we looked at is detection delay. So here's some of the high-level ideas. Guess what? If the goal of the system design was to detect a radar pulse reliably quickly, my Wi-Fi payload should be shorter. Simple, right? Because if the Wi-Fi payload is shorter, probabilistically there's longer quiet periods. As the Wi-Fi payload goes longer, the quiet periods shrink statistically, right? Now, do I control the Wi-Fi payload or you don't, right? But this is just in terms of an academic exercise. One of the key things is that you have a payload, right? The other thing is this. If I can change the diffs, which you can't, it's an idle academic thought, right? The diffs is set by the standard. So two things. If I decrease the payload and I increase the diffs, both of these are good knobs to turn for increasing the probability that a radar pulse drops into a silent. Okay. All right? Okay. So in changing the diffs is no hope. Controlling payload, possibly. All right? But even if you did neither, there is a non-zero probability, 10 to 15%, that a small radar pulse will be detectable. Okay? As opposed to, so as I said, as a system designer, I can wait for this good event to happen, or more likely, the pulse will hit a packet first. Okay? That's the more likely event. And then you have a harder detection problem. Okay? You have a low SINR detection problem. So you have to design, but this is for all of you who are, good 5-layer decoders. So actually, if you want to talk to me, so particularly for, for those of you who have phi persons, OFDM phi high rates, they are very sophisticated LDPC decoders, right? Which do iterative decoding. So actually, you can pull out information from the LDPC decoder, to enhance the probability that you can detect that this is a pulse hit, right? Okay. Most of the other decoders are like convolutional codes, certain rates. They are not so good. But whenever you have iterative decoding, you have, and as I said, we have other work in which, as I said, it's a more difficult problem, so you have to be smarter in how to, look at the physical layer in order to pull out the information that, a radar pulse is the cause of that packet loss. And so this is, the other approach whereby, sorry, how much time do I have? We are a bit late. So let me skip this because this is, known to some of you. Let me talk about, so as I said, having told you a lot about, so this is, a project again with Lorenza, Biljana, and others. This is based on, actually code that CTTC contributed, working on a project that, both us and CTTC worked on LTE Wi-Fi coexistence. And the thing I wanted to point out was this is already about a year and a half old. The project has ended. But, because of the code-based changes that this project, allowed us to do, we are now at the University of Washington using this to actually, enhance and look at more serious current issues about LTE Wi-Fi coexistence, which are kind of seen as hot. All right. Okay. So this is somewhat old. There is a lot more work for those of you who are interested. So as you well know, for operators, this is a burning question. There is now unlicensed Wi-Fi small cell hardware from vendors available, right? And they have this question. In one of these new bands, notably the 5 gigahertz band, do I deploy LTE unlicensed, which have two varieties? According to 3GPP, it will only be LAA, but there's another forum called LTU, and by the way, that hardware is also there. Okay, so there are both types of hardware, at least in the US, available. So two unlicensed varieties, or do I do Wi-Fi? And this is a serious question because let's say take T-Mobile or AT&T Wireless, and I don't know about Telefonica. They must have a large infrastructure of Wi-Fi hotspots all over the place, right? Okay, so if you have either existing hotspots with Wi-Fi and I have more new hotspots, do I continue Wi-Fi? Do I continue with, or do I deploy LTE, or do I deploy a mixture of both? All right? So this is a very serious pragmatic question for answering the congestion problem in local hotspot demand. So so there's a lot of interest in this kind of work, and it started off from this collaboration. All right. What I'll talk about in 10 minutes is the spectrum monitoring infrastructure, which I'm happy to announce is operational. So as I speak, so let me explain to you. This is an NSF-funded project. The idea is this to show that with USRPs acting as sensors, one can actually engineer a RF spectrum gathering system. So we call this an observatory, which is a data collection system, right? Where the data is now publicly archived and it is available for you. You can go to the website. What is the website? Okay. Right now, if you're, sorry, I'll tell you what the website is. It will come up, right? So it's okay. So the data is in a public cloud. You can go and you can, there's a simple query interface. You tell, pick a station. So basically, if you're interested in the data from Seattle or Philadelphia for any reason, you can go pick a station, identify a frequency band, identify a date, the time stamp, and you can download it. All right? Along with metadata, all the code is open source. You get binary data. The parser for the data is open source. It's all on GitHub. Right? We have very extensive pointers for you how to use the data. So based on that data, what are the sort of questions you can answer? In Philadelphia, in that particular band, who's using that spectrum? What is the spectrum occupancy, right? Okay, sort of an average based on power spectral density, let's say, threshold. You can ask more serious questions. What exactly is that signal? Can I decode that signal, right? For those of you who use GNU Radio, which is the open source software suite, you can run decode chains for all types of signals. And basically, this is moving to the sort of signal intelligence, signal analysis, machine learning, whatever, which, by the way, in the US is a huge industry of interest. Okay, and I'll explain to you. There are lots of projects centered from the DoD, from everybody else. Firstly, create such databases. So the DoD has a competition called Spectrum Challenge. Anybody interested? I'll show you the website. Okay? And in a Spectrum Challenge competition, it asks people like you to form a team. The DoD will supply data. So I'll supply you data. Firstly, label data for you to train your machine learning algorithm. And then after you train it, I will give you unlabeled data. That's the competition. All right? So this is an example of an instrument which can gather labeled data and can gather unlabeled data, and provide. Okay, so here's what this looks like is, on the left-hand side, you have a box. Right? So firstly, this is meant for an outdoor deployment. A great, so I've been traveling earlier in the year, I was in Hong Kong. People have, versions of this for indoors, because as you said, spectrum usage is not just outdoors, it's also indoors, right? But this is meant. So, in order for this to happen, the modality is very simple. For all the official stations, if you are a host site, we will send you a box. Okay, what's inside the box? Well, I'll show you the picture of what's inside the box. So here's the architecture. Here is the architecture, all right? This is the box. Inside the box, you have the USRP, motherboard and daughter board. It works with any version of the USRP. Our preferred one right now for cost is the N200 with a UBX daughter board. The front end goes from about 30 megahertz to 6 gigahertz. So I can scan all the way up to all the useful 6 frequencies. All right? So that's there. There is a host PC, like a mini PC, which runs the control software that controls the data acquisition part on the board. So what we are trying to do is, through a remote, so the website, I'll show you the website for those who are interested after the talk. You go to the website, okay? Actually, you can't go to the website. Third-party users don't have, for security reasons, we don't allow third-party users. We only allow third-party users to download the data that's already there. We don't allow you to touch the station and change the knobs. I can do it. So if you tell me, I can go and change the configuration of the data acquisition, which means start frequency, stop frequency. How long do I sit on a channel? How many points for FFT, resolution, right? Gains and all these things, I can change, right? So it gives you a remote user-driven flexibility for changing the data acquisition, right? So for example, this system is operational. I have a lot of interest from various sources to try to do custom data collection, right? Where is it? Somebody wants a wideband scan. Somebody wants to sit on a channel for hours. Why? They were transients. Okay? So you sit on a channel for it. They want to do a dump of, and I'll tell you this. Such an instrument produces a huge amount of IQ data. So the other thing I wanted to point out is instruments like this, firstly, the data was never made publicly available. And even if there were, it was always time averaged. Okay? The purpose of this instrument is to provide raw IQ data as far as possible. Okay. And you will see that as far as possible is very important. Each of these boxes, if I just let it run gathering IQ, it produces raw, uncompressed 80 megabytes per minute. Okay. The budget that I have on Microsoft, by the way, this project is underwritten partly by Microsoft, Azure. Why? Because the data goes on the Azure cloud, and the costs, this is what all I learned in doing the project, so the costs of cloud storage and transactions is not free. Okay. So I get a bill every month, all right? And so obviously, if you know principles of cloud pricing or in cloud services, it depends on not only the storage you're using, what kind of transactions are going on, et cetera, et cetera. Suffice, so I have about 250 terabytes of cloud storage, the cost supported by Microsoft. So I'll show you some calculations later on. 250 terabytes at 80 megabytes per minute will disappear. It will start overwriting in about 30 days, okay, per station. And I have 5 stations. Okay, operating. All right? So you have to compress. A. All right? Not only do you have to compress, think about this. This model of operations is if I send Lorenzo the box and you set it up here, you're providing 2 things for me. Power. So the infrastructure is on a roof. The antenna goes on a mast, right? The box is to weatherproof it, right? So why is this in a box? It's because it's outdoors. So it's weatherproof, and more importantly than weatherproof, EMI proof. If you're in so remember, this is the idea is to be in a metro area. In a metro area, what do you have? You'll have strong emitters close to you. You'll have TV stations, you have LTE-based stations, you'll have FM radio stations, right? It will mess your front end up, okay, depending on how close it is. So as far as possible, okay, this is like a EMI, a Huffman box type enclosure, which adds the cost, right? Okay, you don't need the box if you think you are indoors and you only have 200 milliwatt type transmitters close by. So that's what we send, right? You provide the power, you provide the roof, you provide power, you provide Ethernet to backhaul to the cloud, right? So now let me take it. Suppose you were to do this somewhere up in the mountains where there is no Ethernet that you can drop, right? Well, then you need a wireless backhaul, and you pay the data charges at the rate of 80 megabytes per minute, okay? So there is significant design issues with this as is constructed. But be that as it may, this is an infrastructure that is operating, gathering IQ data. The web interface, this is a screenshot of the web interface. The web interface has 2 purposes, I told you. One is for third-party people to actually download the data if the data is of interest to you, and then post-process it as you see fit, right? For the experimenters who have super user access to this, I change the knobs, and I download data for mine. Okay, so the idea of this is to allow the station host access to their stations to change the data acquisition settings as they see fit to gather data of interest in whatever band, subject to the limitations of the hardware. All right, so that's, all right, and now, so there are lots of knobs here. So now let me say this. So these are the deployments. The deployments are in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Okay, why Philadelphia? That's why NSF and DoD wanted us to do. Originally, the idea was to do it in Washington, D.C., and then they told me that you may get calls from the Secret Service and the President, if you... So, one of the questions, so let me tell you this. When I do this deployment, I did this deployment, guess what the first question is? We'll ask. All your lawyers, and you have lawyers here, right? But if you ask your lawyer, so guess what your first question, so you go around saying, So firstly, do you know you can do this? Can you listen to anything? So the answer is yes, but. So literally, can you put up a, so by the way, I don't know if you play around with this. In the US, so some of you have fast cars, right? And you won't break the speed limit, right? What do we in the US, what do we do? There's the products that we can buy online. They are not legal in the US, but we put it in our cars called a radar detector. What radar are they detecting? Remember the police cop, have you seen, they stand on the roadside with a Doppler measurement, this thing, it jams them. Okay? This is a device that a lot of people use, right? So here's a question. You are detecting some desired signal, right? The question is it legal? You have to be careful what you do. Here's a question. Suppose you took one of this and I went to the Spanish Catalan ministry and I put it up. You are asking for trouble, right? Not a smart thing to do, right? So the point is this, that what did I have to do to stay out of jail? So I had to ask lawyers this. And the first question is, if I asked you, is this possible? The answer is yes, but be smart. Yeah. What is the be smart? This is not easy to be smart, because if I categorized bands, and we did this, so we have a security architecture whereby unknowingly, so remember, I wanted to let station owners have the freedom to download data that they want, but I'm responsible for the overall security policy, that I'm not violating some, So this is a very hard thing to do, because the question I'm being asked is, in Philadelphia, wherever you're gathering data, are there any sensitive bands that I should not be listening to? And if I ask you the question, you have no answer. Do you know what the sensitive bands here are? None of you in the room know the answer, right? Where are the radars? Where are the military equipment, so on and so forth? They won't tell you. I have to tell you all this, right? So there will be bands that they don't want to. But the question so that's obvious. It's the hard part to answer. There is another obvious question, which was the easier question to answer, and which comes from the civilian side. And what is that question? Am I listening to Lorenza's private conversation on your cellular phone? So a lot of civilian, transmissions are poorly encrypted, right? So the first question I got from the lawyers, are you listening to my text and tweets and so on and so forth? And I said, no. Right? Okay, so that's the second question that you, so essentially you have to put in this thing that, so by the way, I give you advice. So you have an, so firstly, these so-called sensitive bands, I have no idea, okay? And I may still get put in some not so nice place if I am inadvertently listening to something. But the one thing I did try to avoid, and we did ask, how do I avoid, what is the appropriate policy, safeguard, of not listening to poorly encrypted or unencrypted civilian speech or text or data? And the answer I was told is, so this is why, because remember, I am gathering IQ data, right? If I take your LTE signal and I dump, 30 seconds of your LTE signal, I'll know everything about what you know. Soon enough, I will have your metadata, I'll have your phone ID, I will have this thing. All right? I can tell you, this is what, the not so nice, covert people do. That's what they do, right? So essentially, I was told I cannot sit and listen to an LTE channel consecutively for more than 1 second, all right? To avoid any personal metadata identification, okay, of your listening, all right? So anyway, my point is this, I have had to deal with all this. If you do this, you'll have to deal with all this. But it is possible to put up such an infrastructure. There at the University of Pennsylvania, 2 campuses. This is the picture of this thing. There at the Temple University, 2 campuses. At Rutgers University, so those of you who knew Philadelphia, I used to live in Philadelphia, I know. The idea is this: take a city center, take a metro area of interest where you have these interesting signals. That's why the need for spectrum sharing is not in the hills of Catalonia, they are in the cities, right? That's why you need to explore the opportunity, outdoors and indoors, right? So you need to have the spectrum monitoring infrastructure in dense areas, right? This is the obvious thing. So the point here is this: low cost, distributed, right? Lots of data being gathered and then mined, for the kind of management, control, optimization options that we all talk about in a lot of academic papers. Right? So I see this as ongoing work to support all of this spectrum sharing type work. And so now, is everything, so you should ask me, oh, this looks too good to be true. Where is the, as we say, no free lunch, as we say in the US? So where is the no free lunch? You know where the no free lunch is? We say famously, you get what you pay for. Okay, what did I pay for this? This software-defined radio costs $2,000 US, right? This entire box with PC cabling and so on and so forth is 4K USD, right? A spectrum analyzer in your lab costs 50K USD. Are you getting data of the quality of that, of a spectrum analyzer that is providing? All right. So the thing, so for example, so let me now go the little. So what has kept me occupied is, why do we have the Seattle? So I told you that we have 2 stations in Seattle. They are where we run all the tests. So these are the official operating listings that go up into the cloud, made public. And the Seattle data, we don't, actually we do make it public, but it is meant for testing, all our algorithms. So what are the things that we are testing? All the imperfections of this. So if you have a 2K, essentially, I'm having a board, with a SDR front end and a back end. Oh boy, I have DC offset. So all those of you who are, physical layer designers, right? There's spurious spikes at the center frequency because of uncompensated DC offset, ADC issues, aliasing at the band edge, and the worst, RF front-end nonlinearities, which And finally, for any of you who are going to use it, the USRP produces uncalibrated. Every board has to be physically calibrated, okay? It produces uncalibrated values. I guess you have to calibrate this. But, so I'll give you an example. This was done a few weeks ago. NIST asked us, I'm done. NIST asked us to sit on an LTE band. And I look at the LTE band and I see some signal, which is not an uplink or a downlink signal, some other signal in that band. I cannot explain it. I asked NIST, and he says, oh, we observed this. I said, what the hell is it? Because it's a band owned by AT&T in Philadelphia. Right? So obviously, if this was an actual, spurious signal by somebody who shouldn't be in the band, AT&T would be jumping up and down and yelling to the FCC. They would have heard of it, and they haven't. So it is an artifact of the instrument. Okay. So there's a lot of things behind this that I'm not telling you under the covers. Yeah? In order, so but it's a start. I think this is one of the things that people have needed and wanted for a long time in order to make the vision of spectrum sharing, real-time spectrum sharing feasible. Okay, I'm going to stop. Thank you. Okay, there's some more pictures here of other deployments. Okay, by the way, so what do? I have my students take this data and say, find the TV stations, find the FM stations, find the LT, the big obvious, sources. Right? And then, of course, there are the unobvious sources, low power sources, signals that I don't know, So this is really like doing detective work. I know something, and the ones that I know, I look for. And then there's lots of stuff that I don't know, which are interesting. Okay. Here's an example, right? This is the TV bands. You can see with these instruments. So you see these spikes? These are FM harmonics. The FM band in the US is 88 to 108 megahertz. This is like the 7th harmonic. Right? So remember, this is 700 megahertz. This is the VHF, TV bands. So you can see, this is not. So these are FM. Okay, these are first order harmonics. We have in the 700 megahertz band, we see 7th order FM harmonics. Okay? So this is not the case. So you can see all types of things that the instrument. So anyway. Okay. Questions? Or
yeah. What kind of compression are you using on?
Lempel zip. Lossless Lempel zip. So actually, what actually happens is this. You see that PC that we have? The data collects to the PC, and on the PC, we wait for 1 minute to compress the data from 80 to 20 megabytes per minute before we upload it. Okay? We can do much more sophisticated this. So right now we just use Lempel zip too.
We have talked a lot of the 5 gigahertz band and the 3 gigahertz band. Now there is a lot of interest in the 60 gigahertz band. Do you have any view on
Not with this,
coexistence.
not with this instrument.
No, no.
So there is no 60 gigahertz front end. So let me tell you you know the answer, right? 60 gigahertz is, or any millimeter wave is really, it's a front end. Even in the US where there's a lot of investment in this, I have a colleague who's a, RF millimeter wave expert. In his lab, he has big antennas and so on and so forth, miniaturizing that, getting the right front ends for these. That's going to be the major. So before we talk about all the algorithms and theories, let the front end be. So there is no commodity hardware now, at all.
About coexistence in this band, for example, for between YGig or
I haven't looked at it, but clearly there's a lot of interest in. So if you ask me, the driver for coexistence is in the congested band. Life is congested up to 6 gig. All of this is uncongested yet, but yes, since these are free, you have a chance to start ab initio and put in collaborative operations right from the beginning. So so there are two different types of scenarios. You have a greenfield scenario where you could force people to collaborate right upfront. Here it's more retrofitting. You already have incumbents and you're trying to allow sharing. So what I talk about is more of the second type. Where you already have every spectrum is already allocated to somebody or the other. Okay, but to millimeter waves, it's much more. I cannot imagine that you're going to have commodity hardware anytime soon. By the way, NSF has a lot of investment. I'm sure I'm sure there are groups which are. I'd love to see a millimeter wave lab and the hardware that's in it, right? But typically the antennas front ends. That is the showstopper. Okay, so you will see papers in which I think maybe Jörg Widmer's group. Does he have hardware? Jörg does millimeter wave in India, but I don't know if he has hardware. Maybe he does. But in the US, I do know of groups which are doing sort of discrete components. This thing. So I'll tell you, I have good colleagues who do ASICs. So for example, doing beamforming at millimeter wave. So things that you can do at RF, on a chip like phase shifters and so on and so forth. It's not easy for 60 gig. Which is why all those famous companies like Brodesson's company before their time. So I think that's going to be the so but coexistence as a principle is going to be below 6 gigahertz there's going to be multiple opportunities for coexistence. So I don't have to wait for millimeter to do coexistence. Yeah, please.
I mean, yes, I wonder if there is any, or if you think there would be any bottleneck for a real-time system and going through the cloud on.
Oh yes. Sorry. Thank you for asking the question. So I told you that, ideally as engineer, the latency is like a minute because that's what I take. So basically within a minute, I expect to see the data in the cloud. False. Depending on that Azure cloud server, I can have about a half an hour delay. So so if I go back to the architecture, right? So I did not point out. So let me go back to this architecture. So this one. By the way, this is the antenna. For those who are interested, this is the antenna. It's a discone antenna. Okay. Essentially. So that's why it's freestanding. I like to have no obstructions. 360 azimuth, low gain. It's not meant to be a high gain antenna. Maybe I think 3 to 5 dBs. So it's basically like a dipole. But this is the antenna that we recommend. You can use your own antenna. This is just. Yeah, this one. So if you look at this Azure cloud, right? It's a shared system. All right. There's lots of queuing. We have seen half an hour delays because of the. So one thing, by the way, I learned is, what you pay for these cloud services, how you get billed. I learned to read a cloud bill. I don't know if you look at it. All right, and roughly the charges are like $4,000 a month.
Why you have Why you haven't decided to build your own cloud with this cost, monthly cost? Maybe it justifies to have your own cloud.
You know, I've asked this question. Why don't you ask your IT guys what are their level of expertise in building a cloud system for you? Okay. The answer is, yeah, your IT people are not, you know, researchers like you who want to move on and do things for you, right? So let me say this. It's an excellent question. As research universities become data-centric, not just this project. So if you imagine in a big university of science projects, you know, people have weather forecasting data, you know, seismic data and so on. Why the hell do we not have, and let me tell you something. Not everybody wants their data in the cloud, right? Okay? I mean, so as a matter of fact, the request that I get for all this data, they say, dump the data and give it to me. You know, dump 50 megabytes of data, put it on Dropbox and share it to me. I don't want it in the cloud, right? So there is every reason to have local clouds. As a matter of fact, NSF has a current project in which they want a hybrid architecture. So this is actually interesting. So it's called Aristotle, for those of you who are computer scientists. Go look it up. Cornell University leads the project, and the idea is exactly the following. We want to have distributed clouds, which maybe mirror, so the AWS, software environment, right? So the cloud, so one question you should ask me, why do I work with Microsoft? You see, the software that I'm using, this control plane software, is written in .NET. Why is it written in .NET? Because it uses a legacy open source project from Microsoft, right? If I had to redo this with all these issues, I would not. I would have a Linux. Okay, so firstly, if I didn't need to have a cloud, I would not use this thing. I would simply have, if you look at the GNU Radio toolchain, it is meant for a Linux distribution, right? And if you came and told me, just give me, instead of 250 terabytes of data, dump, 15 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes of, data, 10 to 50 gigabytes, I would give it to you, right? So there are these use cases, there are different use cases. So this is the reason we went with this. My developer was actually was a Microsoft veteran who had worked on the previous project, etc., etc. It was to prove to NSF that this could be done, that we could have a public-facing thing. But this is a critical question facing universities. You should have your own cloud, right? As a matter of fact, so this Aristotle project actually is an interesting project. Cornell, Santa Barbara, 5 places are building a distributed cloud, mirroring this, using the same. So Aristotle is like an open source version of AWS. Mirroring it, closing, using your cloud. So of course, now, do you have the skills to manage and store it? That's what, your IT people don't have it. But let's assume, these at Cornell, they have it. You will have a local cloud storage, and then you will use AWS as a backup. Or if I needed to, so for example, as an experimenter, I need data from the Cornell's private cloud and Santa Barbara's private cloud. I may then actually join it, federate through AWS and use the computation over there. So either when I need extra computation or VMs and so on and so forth, which these local things don't give me, that's when I go to the public cloud. But yeah, I mean, many of the use cases that I will have with this instrument will be small amounts of data private.
And another question regarding the RF front-end. Have you chosen this only due to budgetary restrictions, or there was another reason? Because maybe you could have used, I don't know, portable spectrum monitoring instruments instead of the USRP one.
Okay. So we have these field fox, we have portable spectrum analyzers. So, but these are used, so remember this. This use case is, so the question that I want to answer is this: wide area sensing. Okay. So that's why I put it on a roof, unobstructed, with, on an elevation. So it's a different use case scenario. So if you give your, students with a portable thing, which we have, you can do indoor sensing, perhaps with this. You can't go outdoor sensing. Outdoor sensing means you drive around, okay. So, and yeah, I mean, the cost is important, this was meant to show an example that you can do a low-cost distributed. By the way, so now I bring to low-cost distributed. We didn't put this in for, but these instruments don't have a GPS. each GPS unit. There exists a, ETA sells, the company sells a GPS unit where it costs $800, $800 US, right? We didn't put in a GPS unit, but we'll have to probably. We put in a GPS unit. So right now, we already have had a request. Can you synchronize two stations and listen to the same band? We can only synchronize over the net. So, my accuracies are milliseconds instead of GPS accuracies. So there's all these, so at the end of the day, when does it do MIMO? We don't do MIMO. We would like to do MIMO, right? So I would like, as you can guess, in an urban environment, I would like to get angular spectrum discrimination, not just look 360 and this thing. So these are all TBDs, right? All good projects, build on this experience to, on receive, I would like to beam very easily. I would like to beam. So if you look at for those, I just came back before I went to, there's a conference I recommend to you called GNU Radio Conference, GRCon. They hold every year. The GRCon was last week, right? And for those of you who don't know, I was telling you that DARPA is a big, DARPA is a huge, so literally software-defined radios in the US, like ETIS and so on and so forth, own their maturity and their increasing existence in projects and prototype research thanks to DARPA. Funded. So if you look at GNU Radio Con, a lot of the projects, open source and other these things is due to DARPA. And it is a very interesting history, a paradox. Why does the US Army supporting open source? I'll ask you if you know the answer to that. Okay? Right? So you think, why is the, so this is, there's a significant user base. DARPA is doing a hack fest in San Francisco with a lot of radio-based solutions. And over there, you will see these things, MIMO, synchronization, literally making cheap hardware approach a ASIC-based, have the capability. Okay. Oh, thank you. For those of you who want to write down I noticed I didn't put the URL.